Justyn Smith here, and I would like to welcome you to our Ministry Tips videos. These Ministry Tips videos are provided for two types of people: those in the ministry and those who are supporting a ministry, like somebody in a congregation, somebody who is a church member who's supporting the work of their pastor or an evangelist or a missionary. Why are we providing these videos? You know, we're supposed to seek wisdom and apply that wisdom to our lives. And we will never know everything, but we want to seek out how we can pursue life, pursue ministry for the glory of God. We don't know everything. We can learn from those who have been there or done that or seen God work according to the principles of His Word. We all need encouragement to operate our ministries and lives according to God's Word, and we have wanted to do these videos for some time, but we were waiting on God's leadership, and so I hope these videos can be a blessing to you. Now, let me give a brief disclaimer before we go any further. I obviously don't know much, but I would like to share some things that God has taught me over the years of ministry and the experiences according to God's principles that may be good refreshers or maybe something you have heard for the very first time. I would love it if you would consider how to apply these tips to your life. Also, I understand that not every situation is created equal, but God's principles are the same and they are enduring and they can be applied in some way to your particular situation. So simply be encouraged by our personal examples and then apply God's principles to your unique situation. My name is Justyn Smith with A Heart for Revival Ministries, and if you would like to discover more information, our online giving platform, or ways to schedule a future meeting, please visit us online at aheartforrevival.com. We would absolutely love it if you'd take the time to visit us on our website. All right, now for the introduction of Episode 1, Ministry Tips. And I need to say that these aren't in any specific order, except for how God brings them up and to our attention. And so simply be encouraged with each Ministry Tips video that comes. I don't right now have a set schedule for these videos, but I do pray that they would be anticipated, that they would be desired, and that when you see them pop up on YouTube, that you would be excited to listen in for a ministry tip, which is also a life tip for the believer who is seeking to glorify God according to living to biblical principles. So here's Episode 1's title: Establish an Emergency Fund. Establish an emergency fund. And I hope I don't lose you right here. Okay, this is an important principle from the Word of God, and I'm about to share with you a couple examples in our life how this practice has helped us so much. Now, let me give you a little bit of hindsight to our situation and the understanding of an emergency fund. Now, we first learned of an emergency fund from Dave Ramsey, who is a big financial mind who encourages, being debt-free and living and utilizing your money for the glory of God. And we appreciate the teachings of Dave Ramsey, and we loosely apply many of those teachings to our financial situation, and we are trying to increase in living more according to them. The given ministry that we have, it's very, very, very difficult to live according to an every dollar budget, if you know what I mean. But the more that we can, the more it helps us financially. And we are currently debt-free, so please understand that when I give these examples, it's not with having some big debts over here, okay? But it is with a debt-free type of understanding that we come giving this. We weren't always that way. We had to learn the ebbs and the flows and the ways of life and living together to be able to understand the hold of money, as well as the gracious way of living that God has called us to. But those are for another video, another time. This video is very simply dealing with an emergency fund. Now, again, I have to give you a little bit more background if you don't know what an emergency fund is. If you do, hang on with me just a second, okay? So the way that the man Dave Ramsey teaches the emergency fund is to first establish a $1,000 emergency fund. And of course, that's in our American culture with the American dollar, with the American way of living. And that would have the idea that you have set aside $1,000 to be able to apply to, oh no, this need popped up and I normally wouldn't have that kind of money, so I'm going to go into debt to provide for it, i.e., the dryer goes out and oh no, I don't have the money for it, but now I do because I've been able to set aside that kind of money, and then I look to refurnish or resupply the emergency fund after I've made the cash purchase. Now, there's another emergency fund, and that is the second emergency fund, as I call it, and it comes later in what Dave Ramsey calls his baby steps, but it is a 3 to 6 month supply emergency fund of your salary. And, sometimes there's little things you don't include in there or other things, but kind of like your base understanding of what you're going to need if you lose your job for 3 months, for 6 months. And the greater that fund can be, the greater a help it's going to be in that level of emergency. Again, if you're listening from a different culture than our American culture, the numbers are going to be different. As well in America or your ministry, the numbers are going to be different based upon your income level, where you are at, and how you are living, etc. So I have to give that simple understanding of what I mean by an emergency fund. Now, let me talk about how establishing an emergency fund is so helpful in your life as an individual, in your life as a ministry leader, in your life as a believer for the glory of God. In our life, there have been 2 big times where we have been allowed by God and also purposed to set aside money that would be considered that second emergency fund, that 3-month supply, so that when emergencies came up, we were able to provide for. And I'm going to give those illustrations here in a second, but let me explain to you from the Bible perspective, the Bible's principle, why an emergency fund could be applied to your ministry, to your individual life, and be a huge, huge help in times of unexpected need or expecting the unexpected. Notice what it says in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 6, 7, and 8. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise. Then it says in verse 7, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. Now, when I look at these verses, I consider that we are talking about one of God's creatures, the ant that has been created. We are considering that there is a way about man called laziness. The word sluggard is used right here. We are to consider the ways of an ant, that an ant is not lazy, an ant is not a sluggard, but wise. Here's how. Which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, meaning, you know what, if somebody would just force me to do it, I'd be able to provide or save for my future. Well, these ants, they don't have somebody who's leading over them doing that. Okay, there's no guide, no overseer, no ruler. They just know that they are supposed to do it. Notice what they do. They provide her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. So that means there is the whole idea of tilling, there's a whole idea of sowing, there's a whole idea of caring for, providing for, so that when it comes time to the harvest, there is fruit to be taken in that is then to be set in store for the winter months where no food can be gathered. That means I'm not living in the luxuries of what I have now in excess or overboard, but I am working with my hands. I am laboring to take in. I am setting aside, understanding that the future needs to be provided for, and God is providing for me right now. I've got to get up. I should not be lazy. I should not be a sluggard, but I should go forward. And this biblical principle of establishing an emergency fund is going to be so helpful for you as you look to what God has for you in your future, for your church in its future. Establishing an emergency fund is going to provide for those seasons where it doesn't come in. Think about it like this. As I have pastored before, it has been so helpful to have had set aside some finances so when the giving isn't as much as it was last month or the month before, if it's entirely necessary, we can draw from that emergency fund and we could apply it to our particular situation. Now, as I pastored, we really didn't have much of a need for that. But when it came down to evangelism, there was a great need for that. And we have two stories, as I mentioned earlier. You could take or leave these stories, but these are how God used the establishment of that second emergency fund in our life to help us to be able to provide for those winter months, those emergency needs in our situation. So, the first time that God allowed us to utilize a second emergency fund, a 3-month supply of salary, we were in the pastorate. God was allowing us to take in more money than we had ever taken in before, and then purpose to set aside finances for the future. We had a great desire to have a second emergency fund just because we didn't know what was ahead. And lo and behold, God led us to a great step of faith. It was a very difficult step of faith in regards to everything that God was establishing and doing in the pastorate, but He very clearly led us to establish a Heart for Revival Ministries and step out for His glory in that direction. When we did that, the given situation called for the need to step out completely in faith with no idea of where the funding or the finances were coming from. But we had that 3-month supply in the bank account. And I tell you what, my dear friends, it's one thing to save money, but it's another thing to have to use that money because it's not coming in from any other direction. We were praying, we were still serving, we were attempting what God was wanting us to do for His glory. In the process of time, God allowed us to see that emergency fund drained in that 3-month supply for about a 3-month time period. And it came down to the end of that emergency fund. And I tell you, this is a testimony to how God is your great provider. You set out to do in the first place what God would have you to do according to His principle by going to the ant, considering her ways, and not being slothful and providing for your time of need. You did your part, and then you get to watch and see how God does His. And about the end of that 3-month time period of utilizing that second emergency fund, God then provided a check in the mail for our family that replenished that fund again. And it was huge because we needed it as we were getting started in the work of the ministry. And that's just our unique testimony to how God had utilized an emergency fund like that and then supplied for it as we stepped out in faith. That's a big deal. And we're nothing special. God can do this for anybody. God is not limited. He is limitless, and He is the great provider. A second scenario for our family, considering an emergency fund, happened recently. This is the year 2022. This summer and fall has not been a very big financial stretch for us. We had recently in the spring, first part of the summer, we had great provisions come in, and we were able to, in wisdom, and had to fight it a little bit, right? Because when it comes down to money, there's a great pull, but we were able to see an emergency fund, the second emergency fund, supplied for again, which had been something that we were slowly working towards, but in what we do, it's not like we can fill it up fast unless the Lord provides greatly. And so we had that second emergency fund again, that 3 months supply. And it has been amazing how we look back from this October 2022 on the past few months and recognize how even though we've been faithful in the ministry as God has given it to us, we have still had to utilize all of it. And that whole second emergency fund has been drained again. But I tell you what, my dear friends, what if we did not have that emergency fund established? What if we just, oh, look, we've got all kinds of money. Let's spend it. It would not have helped in the way that God could have helped through the provision of that emergency fund. And so when I'm talking about your ministry, I don't know how God's leading you, but I do know that there is a principle that you can apply to your ministry found in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 6, 7, and 8 that will help because it's going to alleviate any stresses that could come. Let's read the verses again. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise. Having no guide or overseer or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. What would it be like to not have that food in the winter months? What would it be like? It would be stressful. You would be scratching here and scratching there, trying to make ends meet. And though our family is in a position right now where we don't have it, or we don't have what we used to have, we can look back on these months and recognize it's been a whole lot easier on us having had the utilization of an emergency fund than not having had it. Now, there might be stretches ahead where it's going to be we don't have the emergency fund established because it's just like back-to-back trials. We don't know what's coming, but here's what we do know. God is our great provider. Let's do our part to make sure that when it comes to money or when it comes to food or whatever kind of culture you are in what kind of emergency fund you need to establish, again, whether it be monetary or whether it be along the lines of food or whatever, you have been like the ant. You have considered her ways. You haven't been lazy, and as best as you possibly can, you have fought those fleshly desires to live in excess, and you've gone on to provide for your church, for your ministry, for your family, and therefore you can look back and say with no regrets, I understand I'm in a time of need right now, but with no regrets, I have found myself in a place where I have honored God with my finances. I have given graciously, but I've also set aside. I've had to use that which is set aside, but in utilizing that which is set aside, I have applied the principle from Proverbs 6. Now look back on your life right now. Have you applied that principle? Or with everything that comes in, do you just waste it? Now, I'm not talking about you have needs and the whole paycheck has to go to needs. We understand that. But what I'm talking about is the wisdom to set aside and the liberty that comes when you go through a month where you don't have a lot, but you're able to utilize. I tell you what, it was a very difficult thing to be able to start saving like that, but it has paid off so much to be able to look back on those moments and realize how it has helped our family during great times of need. Now, again, God is our great provider. For instance, an illustration, whether the gas is $5 a gallon or whether the gas is $2 a gallon, He's the same type of provider no matter what the expenses are, and He can meet your needs. So go to God. But don't live a lazy life when it comes down to what you can do and how you can pursue to provide for your family or to provide for your ministry. Now, I sure hope that this particular title in Ministry Tips has been a blessing to you. We're talking about establishing an emergency fund, Ministry Tips, Episode 1. This has been a challenge again to me. And now, it may take us a very long time to establish the emergency funds again, but I am just rejoicing on how God has allowed us to be able to, a couple different times in our life, establish these emergency funds and then use them. The idea would be that you wouldn't have to be like us. We have to use these types of emergency funds so often compared to those who have just been able to have a steady job with a steady income. But praise be to God for those who go in, they gather, then they take and they apply what they need to right now, but then they're able to set aside some for the future because they don't know what the future holds, and then they trust in the living God who gives them richly all things to enjoy. My dear friends, thank you for listening to our first episode of Ministry Tips, and I pray that somehow, some way, it has been a blessing to you today. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and have a great day.